Alright, welcome back. We're going to start 21.4 looking at annelids and segmented worms. At this point you should have taken already a quiz 31, which was over 21.1 to 21.3. That would be the idea at this point. Let's review just a little bit. I guess some of that will be from the last lesson, but we were looking at in the last lesson kind of everything from echinoderm. So echinoderm means, again, spiny skin or hedgehog-like, and so that's what an echinoderm is. Think about starfish, sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, all of those things that are pointy. What is the unique system that starfish have? So you'll notice echinoderms are the only animals with a water vascular system that's going to be useful in their radial canal, the part that helps them move. Of course, they have a central disc. We mentioned the rays that come off of those. At the end of each ray is an eye spot. We mentioned those as well. What are those special feet called that starfish have? Okay, you should be saying tube feet. And so then we talked about from starfish, we went to rotifers, and really rotifers just means wheel-bearing, but we mentioned that they are able to produce eggs that do not need to be fertilized, and so we use the term parthenogenic to describe that. After those two, those were both in their own group there, we had echinoderms and rotifers. And then we went to coelenterates. Coelenterates specifically are hollow gut. Coelenterate means, hollow and hollow gut. And so cnidocytes are going to be special cells that can be found inside of these. And what do they do with cnidocytes? They sting stuff. And so there's a venom that's produced, or a toxin, or a paralytic enzyme, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, it's going to incapacitate whatever it touches. It's going to pull it into its hollow gut and digest it. What are the two body types that coelenterates can have? So you should be saying polyps and medusas. Polyps and medusas. And so then after that we talked about hydras. Hydras, of course, reproduce by budding. They're unique. They look like they'd be sessile, but they actually somersault. And then we went into the alternation of generation life cycle of jellyfish. Jellyfish go between medusa and polyp throughout their lives. And so you'd want to be familiar with that. Then we mentioned sea anemones. Anemones, of course, have stinging cells or cnidocytes as well. Then we mentioned coral. Coral have more of a calcium carbonate cup that they can hide into. And then, of course, on 438, we talked about sponges, porifera. Porifera, of course, they have that opening at the top, and we call that the osculum or the oscula, depending on how many there are. Then you have the ostia, which were the in-current pores. And so in-current ostium, ex-current osculum. And so those were the important terms that you needed to know. Also, on the bottom right of 438, I mentioned the term spicules. The spicules are simply the silica-based glass-like particles that give the structure to a sponge, and so those are very important as well. All right, well, we have about 20 slides to cover in this particular lesson, and so like I said, if we don't finish it all, your proctor will just show you the rest of this video tomorrow, but I'm going to start the timer. I'm going to try to keep this video just about the same as the last one, about 30 minutes or so, and so I'm going to burn through material very quickly. Here we go, starting with, let me click into it. Worms. And so this particular one on page 439, we introduced the topic of worms. There's really three groups of worms, several phyla of worms and worm-like animals. The three main ones are segmented worms, flatworms, and roundworms. Of course, I've got a picture of each one at the bottom in that order. So you can clearly see this guy here in his segments. He has little rings that make him up. Then, of course, you got this flatworm, and then you have these roundworms. You can see they're actually round. Obviously, they're distinguishable from the segmented worms because you can't actually see the different rings on it. Now, there is a thunderstorm going on while I'm recording this, so if you hear big booms, yeah, nature's happy. It's ready to explode. So those are the three types of worms, and probably understanding that you guys you can't hear it. We'll find out when the recording gets done. So at this time we're going to talk about the first group, and that's going to be segmented worms. The group is called annelids. And really, I think annual growth rings like trees, and so my brain says, okay, it's got rings, annelids. Includes earthworms, seaworms, and leeches. And so for the most part, earthworms and leeches you know about. Seaworms are kind of rare, and so we don't really see that many of those. But they have cylindrical bodies. You know what a worm looks like. But each one of those segments is divided into its own ring. The head on one end and an anus on the other. It's just a tube structure. Again, pretty standard. So here's your worm. Okay, something like this. And so you kind of got the head on one end. You can pick which one's the head, and of course it goes to the bathroom out the other side. So in most annelids, each segment is separated by a dividing wall called a septum. Okay, so in each one there's a ring here, there's a ring here, there's a ring here. Inside of this there's an entire wall out here, and each one of these lines that divides it is a septum. You'll see that on your book, page 439. Each segment is divided by a thin wall called a septum, and so that's going to surround the entire thing. So dividing wall called a septum. Now, by the way, that term is not new. This is also, you know, I'm not an artist by any means, but nose. This bridge of your nose is called the septum. Also, the heart. Okay, you've got your atria up here and your ventricles down here. The wall that separates everything is called the septum, and so separating walls have always been called septum in this particular book. The digestive tract, nerves, and blood vessels pass down the middle of the segmented worm. It's all inside of the interior of the worm. Rows of external bristles attached to each segment. Now this is important because actually, going back up to my picture here, you will notice, oh, I erased him. And we have our kind of worm, and we'll make him a little short here. And so he's got little bristles on him. Now you would never see these because they're microscopic. But he has little bristles, and those are the part that help him move, and so we'll get rid of that now. All right, I'll show you a real picture. All right, so first of all, here's the kind of main structure. Again, the septum would be this line that divides and circulates all the way around, so you see each segmented part. That's what gives this thing the term annelid. It's got different parts. Now, prostomium, we're going to come back to this term in just a little bit. Prostomium, also CD, all these terms really matter. You'll notice that the digestive tract, you got an esophagus, crop, gizzard. You also have all these other parts. Notice the heart structure, notice the nervous system, and then, of course, down here at the reproductive system of the worm. All right, let's talk about earthworms for a moment. We're on page 439 looking at earthworms. These are the typical annelids when you do a dissection, when you do a biology lab or something and you want to study an annelid, you're going to probably cut open an earthworm because they're much larger than leeches. Good, by the way. And so many times earthworms are nocturnal. You won't really see these during the day. The only time you really see these ever is when they die on the sidewalk because they got dried out, or when they're coming out in the morning because it just rained, which of course requires them to die on the sidewalk when they don't make it far enough. So there are 4 pairs of what's called setae on each body segment, and I'll show you those. Those are the little hooks on the worm. They move by extending the setae and then shortening its body. So again, here's an earthworm. No one's surprised by this. And so we do have, by the way, the obvious end here is the head. There's no tricks to this. It is exactly what it looks like. Now here are the setae. I think you can see those very fine. So there's about 4 pairs of these all the way around the worm. And so he uses these individual hooks as he crawls around the ground to pull himself and make motion possible. Also, notice the mouth of the worm here and this prostomium. We're going to come back to this term, but that prostomium is this shovel-like mouth appendage that pulls the food in. He actually eats dirt. That's what he does. So let's talk about the respiration. First of all, like frogs also breathe, but they also can pull air through their skin. Earthworms' smooth skin allows for a direct exchange of gases, but because of that exchange, their outer surface must remain moist. They have to be a wet worm. And so most of the time you've touched a worm, it's been slimy. It cannot be able to, it cannot respirate, it cannot breathe unless its skin is moist. And so, of course, it produces mucus. And it also burrows if it gets difficult. If it gets too hot, it'll go underground, etc. If it gets too cold, it'll also go underground. If dry by sunlight, it will suffocate. So those poor worms that you see on the sidewalk That is actually suffocation. Once they cease to have moisture in their body, they will die. When it rains, they must escape the soil or they will also die. Kind of a sad life to be a worm. So sensation, of course, let's see if I can go through this real quickly. The nervous system consists of nerves, a nerve cord, and a tiny brain. The brain consists of a bundle of nerve cells or ganglia and is located in the third segment. So you can find the brain of this particular creature in the third segment of the worm. The annelid specifically coordinates body movement. It's more important that worms are coordinated than that they're thinking, so that's important. They don't have sensory organs, however, they are sensitive to light, touch, chemicals, and electricity. So you can imagine being a worm going towards light or away from light is really important. Circulation, going back to this, red blood cells containing hemoglobin. This is unique because most of the things we've talked about in this chapter don't have hemoglobin. They have some type of cyanoglobin, but also they have blue blood or clear blood. 2 large blood vessels, so this is unique too. And so it has what's called an aortic arch, arranged in 5 pairs near the head. So I'll show you that real quickly. Here are the aortic arches. You can think of them like little hearts. Notice they're not actually hearts, but they are aortic arches. They are pumps. There are 5 on each side, and so he has 10 total aortic arches. All right, let's talk about how they eat. Here's your prostomium. I meant to use that word earlier. An earthworm's digestive system is a tube within a tube. Think about it. He is a very simple creature. He has a mouth, esophagus, crop gizzard. So again, crop, storage of food. Gizzard is the grinding of food. Intestines, anus, and the glands. It has some extra glands for digestion as well. No, they don't eat hummus. They eat humus. Hummus is what you eat, kind of a snack food. Humus is decayed organisms, particles in the soil. It literally eats through the soil, and it uses something called the prostomium to scoop soil into its mouth. Honestly, I think this picture back here is the best example of that prostomium. To show you that, I think it's very helpful. But going back to where we were, I think we were talking about digestion. And so, again, here's kind of the structure and the entire tube. Of course, giving a little bit more, this is kind of the whole picture. You'll notice the segments. Here's the prostomium. That's the main reason I have this picture here. But you can kind of see it all happens. Notice in the first, second, third little group, there's the brain. And that's what we've been talking about. Of course, reproduction happens kind of in this segment back here, etc. And then we're going to talk about these nephridias, these multiple coils here. This is how they go to the bathroom. Okay. Excretion. Liquid waste are eliminated by nephridia. Mentioned those just a second ago. And going back here, those are those coiled tubes, and they're all along this creature's body. These nephridia. Also, nephrons, remember, were part of our kidneys. This root word still has to do with that. They function like the tiny kidneys of a worm, and so one end opens into the body cavity while the other end opens to the exterior. So pulling out bad things and pushing in new, that's what we're talking about. Remove waste and aid in a salt balance, preventing a loss of excess moisture. Obviously, a worm will die if not. And so here are your nephridia. These are little tubes, and so of course they're part of the capillary network. You're going to pull out the toxins from blood and then going to the bathroom out of these sides, these ciliated funnels. So one going into the body, from the body, out the body. That's what we're talking about. So then we move on to sea worms. This is going to be on page 440. Sea worms. Sea worms are unique because we don't see much of them. I'll go through this pretty quickly. Largest class of segmented worms. This is actually the largest class, but I said it wasn't familiar. Again, it might be common in nature, but it's not common for people to see, but are not very well known because they live in the sea. Now, they vary drastically in size. Your book mentions the different sizes they can be. Now, the reason why we don't see them very often is they hide in tubes similarly to coral. And so when they're out and about, you won't really notice them. They're underwater anyway, but otherwise they'll spend most of their lives in tubes. Now, they do have eyes and sensory appendages. Now, what's going to stand out to them is this unique appendage as well. So with earthworms, it was the setae, those little hooks. But on sea worms, they have these fleshy lobes called parapodia, that assist in the movement and respiration. So I would think of them more like gills, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. So again, these little fuzzers on the side here are the ends of this. This is a sea worm. And again, I'm assuming he's eating a sea urchin here. Don't understand all of the details, but we've got a sea worm. You can clearly see a segmented body, and so clearly a destructive creature. They do have little tubes that they live inside of. Here's some little amphipod, little shrimps, basically living on here. Looks like some mussels as well. Some cool stuff going on, but these are where the little worms live, not necessarily the one you saw in the last portion. Again, the segmented body. Notice the parapodia. I would think of these more like gills. They're part of the respiration for the sea creatures. All right, let's go to leeches. Thunder's just roaring outside here. So, again, going through this quickly, they lack CT and parapodia. If they don't have CT, they don't move very well on land because they can't grab onto surfaces. So good news is they live in water. Most are aquatic, somewhat flattened bodies until, of course, they start sucking blood. They have a suction disc on each side. At this point in our year, we've watched a video of a crab being eaten by a leech, tiger leech specifically. Most are parasites, so they gain benefit while taking nutrients from another creature. Attach with one sucker and pierce with the other, so they'll attach to one end and they have, of course, the blades on the other. And then, of course, it mentions the history and modern use. You look at that segment on page 441 about them. It says leeches have been used for medicinal purposes since the Middle Ages. For many years, they were used to remove blood from sick persons, often in belief that these diseases were fevers caused by bad blood. Even today, however, leeches are used medically to remove excess blood from limbs that have been surgically reattached following an accident. I understand that, of course, bruising causes a lot of internal bleeding, and so they use leeches to help with that. So leeches are not out of modern medicine. Also, it mentions the anticoagulant. Most creatures, mosquitoes, leeches, etc., that bite and slurp blood, they really need this anticoagulant. Coagulation is simply the clotting of blood, and so they cease your blood from clotting so that they continue to suck out the blood and the nutrients. Even today, however, leeches are used medically to remove excess blood from limbs that have been surgically reattached. The anticoagulant found in these, which seems to work far better than anticoagulant that man has devised, is also used to prevent and treat blood clots. And so they're quite useful creatures. Although, yes, absolutely disgusting. Here's a picture. Of course, you can see the segmented body. Usually they're flattened until, of course, they're sucking blood. But man, is that just gross. All right, so, of course, they do have that segmented body. Here's the end that has the jaws, has that kind of triangle jaw shape. And, of course, here's your sucker. All right, so then we go from annelids to the second group of worms, and that's going to be platyhelminths. That's a fun word to say, but platyhelminths. Now, I, for some reason, have trained myself. First of all, you need to train yourself to spell this word because that's not, so platypus, helmet, mints. I don't know. And so you got to spell this word. And I've trained myself to think these are actually not platyhelminths, but flattyhelminths with an F. And the thinking I have here is that they're flatworms, and I'm thinking also helmets. So if you work on a construction site and you don't have your helmet on, of course you get hit in the head and it hurts, and it might beat you flat. I don't know, but that's what I'm thinking. So it comes from a Greek word that means flat, and so to the Greeks this word makes perfect sense. To 2019 America, we're kind of like platyhelminths. How about flatworms? Two classes of these particular worms. There are two, and we're going to talk about them at quite a length actually. Flukes and tapeworms. Specifically, flukes and tapeworms, we'll talk about those, but they're both parasites. And then there's one, planaria, that kind of just eats vegetation in ponds. You can actually see a planarian on page 441. And so, kind of interesting flat worms, but they're in fact flat. Most of these live in water, which means some don't. Here's a planarian. Here you can clearly see, obviously a sketch, but his flat body shape and what's going on. All right, let's talk about planarians for a little bit. I'm going to give all of the points so that you can write stuff down if you're going to. But the planarians are on 441. It says these are free-living. That word means not a parasite. It eats on its own, doesn't need to eat something else. Free-living flatworms that live as scavengers. And it mentions that if you ever wanted to find these, you could simply take a piece of liver. Apparently worms like livers. Take that liver, put it in a pond, and in just a little bit of time, the liver will be covered in these planarians. Now, it mentions that they're less than an inch in length, which means they're not microscopic, but you'd be able to easily see them. not necessarily microscopic. Now they do have cilia on their lower surface. Those are just little hairs that allow them to kind of glide. If they're on the bottom, they use a slime. They have 4 body systems. So again, small creature usually means to me lack of complexity, but apparently they have a nervous system, digestive system, excretory, and even reproductive. Now they do have 2 light-sensitive eye spots. They don't see like you and I do, but they do, in fact, need to see for light's sake. Now, it mentions in your book that they get the nickname cross-eyed worm because of these eye spots. Now, they reproduce sexually, however, they can reproduce asexually. Here they are, these little platyhelminths, or these planarians. Platyhelminths just means flatworms. Man, they're cute. And so here's their cross-eyed worms, and so those are their simple eyes, and they're, of course, eating some kind of meat right here, but that's what we're talking about. All right, let's talk about flukes. Now, this is where, by the end of this lesson, if you're not scared to death of worms, then I've just failed. But part of this is just being aware that, of how this works. Part of this is for your own health. If you ever become a missionary, you become a traveler, you become whatever, and you go across the country. In America, this is still an issue, but much more in other underdeveloped places in the world. And so, flukes, first of all, classes, trematoda, if you needed to know that for, I wanted to include those words just so you know what's going on. Give you a couple more things here. Parasitic flatworms that spend a part of their life as the parasite of snails. Okay, so who's the bad guy in this one? It's a snail. It's a complicated life cycle requiring 2 alternate hosts, and every single one of them requires a snail. So apparently the second host doesn't matter. It could be you, it could be a dog, it could be whatever, but it has to have a snail. I'll let you try to say this word clonorchiasis. Okay. Interesting disease that they can cause, but the solution here is just cook your food, please. But let's talk about it for a moment. All right, so liver flukes, that's what they're called, flukes in general. So the parasitic worms, and so the basic cycle is this. Whatever creature it is, sheep, your book uses a sheep, a cow, whatever, eats food. Now, it really, the cycle is going to go further, but the food goes into its liver, and the particular creatures that are living there, they're actually pieces that came from a snail, go through his digestive tract, go in his fecal matter, and lay the eggs. So here are the eggs. Eventually, in 2 to 4 weeks, they hatch, and because snails go around eating things off the ground, they will carry some of those liver fluke larvae inside of them, eventually putting those over to a plant that the cow will eat, and the cycle continues. So again, these live inside of the liver and many times in creatures, and so that's what we're talking about. Now, of course, no slide like this would, first of all, disgusting, but no slide like this would be complete without a real picture. So here's a liver that's been cut open with some flatworms in it. These are flukes. They're not like the typical worms, but again, I don't want those in my body. That just is absolutely painful looking to me. All right, let's talk about tapeworms. Tapeworms are on page 443, and so tapeworms are also parasitic worms that live in the intestines. So flukes live in the liver, tapeworms live in the intestines. Mentions in here that they're long, flat, ribbon-like. They really do look like a tape measure or something like that, hence the term tapeworm. Their body is divided into segments, but because of their flatness, they become flatworms instead of segmented worms. Some attain lengths of 10 to 20 feet. I don't even want to know the story behind the 20-footer, but wow, maybe cows or something. Most are only a few inches long, and so they mention here that, of course, if you see a tapeworm, you can't just yank them out because, of course, they have hooks on their head. That head is unique. It's called the scolex. Scolex, if you say it fast, it sounds kind of like a skull. And so the small knob-like head is called the scolex, which is equipped with hooks and suckers. And so let me see if I got a picture here. First of all, tapeworm. Okay, that's just gross in and of itself. You can see their flatness there, and they do have little segments, and as they grow, they get more segments. They live in the intestines. Here's the scolex. Notice the little hooks that are on each side. These are suckers over here. And so the life cycle is quite complicated. In your book, page 443 says, tapeworm embryos, growth in this takes place in a region just behind the head, where new segments are continually formed. The tapeworm grows in length each time a new segment is formed. Each segment contains reproductive structures for producing both sperm and eggs. The eggs are fertilized within the segments. Mature segments near the posterior end are periodically detached and pass out of the host. So once a host is infected with these worms, the eggs go out in the feces. Tapeworm eggs are dispersed in this process with the solid waste that pass from them. Tapeworm embryos on the ground must be taken into an alternate host if the life cycle is to continue. If these eggs are eaten by a suitable host, they hatch and the larvae migrate through the bloodstream. When the juvenile tapeworms reach these tissues, they form cysts, become dormant. Later, if the meat is eaten, the tapeworm and the cysts are freed, and they then attach themselves to the intestines of the new host. So basically, the trick to this is, please cook your food. Just cook your food. Okay, and so here's the trick. So we've got, again, Scolex. Here's that head with the suckers and horns and hooks and all that. Tapeworm, of course, the idea is fecal matter comes out. Some livestock eats it. This is particularly pork. Pork's kind of bad for worms, and so particular eggs go into the meat. If you don't cook your meat, you eat this stuff, you get worms, and that goes through, and the cycle continues forever unless we just cook our food. Okay, let's talk about nematodes. Nematodes. We are on the next page here, 443, going on to 444. Nematodes specifically. These are round worms. So nematoda means threadworm. They look like threads. They don't have they have a thin cuticle, like a waxy layer around them, and they're especially abundant in soil. This is actually one of the ways to get these particular worms. You really want to wear shoes. That's all I'm going to say about that. Don't walk around barefoot. I know I'm talking to Kentuckians, but wear shoes. Many live as parasites, but some are free living, so many of them live on things or they live on their own. Most are very small. They live in the digestive system. There are 4 major ones, and I'm going to talk about each one very quickly, but we have the filaria worm, the hookworm, the trichina worm, and the ascaris worm. And so trying to kind of burn through these, here's the filaria worm. First of all, this one inhabits the lymphatic system and produces a condition known as elephantiasis. Lymphatic system, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but of course you have lymph nodes, and if they swell, you actually get quite a swelling on the outside of the flesh. Therefore, this elephantiasis is a swelling of the body. This blocks lymph vessels, causing swelling. It's raining really hard. I'm sorry if that is obnoxious in the microphone. But blocked lymph vessels causes swelling. That's what we're talking about. So blocked lymph vessels cause swelling. Another type lives in the heart of dogs and cats, producing a condition known as heartworm. So once these filaria worms get into your animals, they produce this thing called heartworm. Of course, we have medicines for that, but that's what we're talking about. So larvae are transmitted by mosquitoes and biting insects. And so here's all that's going on with that. So the particular larvae go into your animals. They go into mosquitoes. When they bite something, they give the worm to whatever eats it. Of course, they live in the intestines, in the lymphatic system. They can go through the blood, they can reproduce, and then of course the cycle continues. And of course here's elephantiasis. That's a normal leg on the left, elephantiasis, kind of extreme example on the right. But again, that's swelling. You can clearly see where they get that terminology for elephant. I do hesitate, though, because this is an actual person's body that obviously is in pain, hesitate to kind of make a joke out of it, but it really is almost painful to look at filaria worms blocking the lymphatic system. Of course, we got hookworm as well. Hookworms are parasitic worms as well, roundworms that live in the host intestine and suck blood. Now, I'm going to go through this slide kind of quickly. It's widespread in kind of the central part of the world, burrows through the host's feet from the ground. So again, if you're not wearing shoes, you should be. Okay, don't just assume you can walk anywhere you want, whenever you want, and since you've never had a problem, just whatever, I guess. Goes through the blood to the lungs, so it goes through the foot, through the blood, into the alveolus, so alveoli in general, through your trachea, into your throat, your esophagus falls into the intestines. Once it gets there, now as gross as that is, it's been all over your body. It attaches to the intestinal wall and causes what we call anemia. And this can be controlled by good sanitation. Simply, if you take, hookworm is usually contained in fecal matter, feces. You don't just step on dirt and get these. It's dirt that's been contaminated with these worms. Now, of course, here is the same idea. So the worms are somewhere. They penetrate the skin somehow. They go through the lungs, go into your throat. You swallow them. They go into your intestines, pass through the fecal matter. And, of course, this Next one I wanted to talk about as well. The trichina worm is a parasitic roundworm that causes the disease trichinosis, transmitted by eating poorly cooked pork infested with roundworm cysts. And so this is what we're talking about. Again, I apologize for the rain if it's loud, but transmitted by eating poorly cooked pork infested with roundworm cysts. Infected pork may contain up to 100,000 encysted worms. So again, cook your food, please. Attached to the intestinal wall, enter the lymphatic system and bloodstream, going everywhere. Lots of bad things that can be associated with this. Just cook your food and you won't have to worry. So again, here's kind of the cycle. So your larvae are ingested. They live inside of the intestines. They join. Of course, it goes through fecal matter into the food, makes a cyst. You don't cook the food. You eat the cyst. It goes into your body, and you get damage. Here are some microscope slides of those things. Of course, I mean, just look at that. Wouldn't that just be so much better if you cooked it instead of getting worms, you know? Anyway, cook your food. All right, let's talk about the Ascaris worm. Okay, children are most commonly affected by this worm. Soiled hands and other soiled objects in the mouth. Again, this is something that washing hands is really important. Like many worms, they live in the intestines. They can become so numerous that they block the intestines, and at which point you would die because you're not removing waste from your body. That's just horrifying. Monsters inside me kind of stuff. Eggs hatch in the intestines and end up attached in the intestines. Now, a female may lay as much as 200,000 eggs a day. This, without medical help, this is fatal. I mean, there's nothing you can do about this. Medicine's the only way. Of course, cleanliness. Wash your hands all the time. Now, of course, this is probably more familiar if you've ever had dogs, and you might have a dog that you love so much. Particularly, I have a great dog, and thinking through this, basically, the worms can actually lay dormant in the flesh of the animal and actually be transmitted to the progeny, to the young dogs. They can have never been infected through the ground, but they can actually get it just from being born of the mother, and the worms go into the babies. And so treating animals for worms, and this is not just dogs, it's cats, it's humans, it's everything. And so basically the point is these particular worms go into the intestines. Notice the different parts of the intestine, the cilia there that they're sucking nutrients from. These are, again, Ascaris worms. And so, of course, going fecal matter into the ground, into the form of eggs. They, of course, can go into skin of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's a dog or human or whatever. Dogs will eat something, whatever. And then once it goes through, it really is that simple. And if, of course, that animal reproduces, it can be destroyed in this animal and actually lay dormant in the mother. And so it can actually go on to the progeny. And so that would be obviously quite scary. But there is, of course, medicine for this. And so that's very important that we take care of this. And these are little white worms that are found in the fecal matter of your animals. So always take a moment to look if you love your dog. So there's that. So coming back full circle then, that kind of ends our lesson. Before we end, I do want to mention that you have a quiz tomorrow as well over 21.4, 21.5, and so your proctor will be giving that as well. Otherwise, there would be no homework for this particular assignment. Have a good day.